Hi. In this video, this is part 2 of story and plot. In the last video, I briefly introduced story and plot, and then you read the Burroway chapter and then the Tomlinson section on story and Tomlinson's story and plot. So in this video, I'm going to go much more in depth into story and plot. So the first thing I just want to touch on is the fundamental forms of story. And these are discussed in Burroway and Tomlinson. These are the scenarios that or concepts that they wrote about with, story as a journey or story as connection and disconnection from Burroway, among the other one. And Tomlinson, he discusses classical story, the plotless story, stranger comes to town, all of those things. So those are some of the more common forms of story, and those kind of go along with the 7 basic plots. But we'll talk about this in a minute. So Tomlinson discusses the classical story structure, which is the setup, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. And these are all the parts of the narrative arc. Also, there's an inciting incident or a hook in the beginning. We'll discuss all of this in the next video where we break down structure a lot more and kind of quantify structure a little bit. So the last video introduced story and plot. This video is going to go more in depth on the concepts of story and plot. And then in the next video on structure and the narrative arc, we'll discuss how to structure a story and how to manipulate structure to best suit your story. So in writing, there are not a whole lot of rules that you can't break, but when it comes to story and plot, these rules you cannot break. These are expected in every story. When we discuss structure and how to manipulate structure in the narrative arc, it doesn't necessarily, these things don't necessarily have to be in this order, but there has to be an inciting incident or hook, something that grabs the reader and sets the action of the story in motion. That's what an inciting incident is. Conflict, there has to be conflict in the story. It can be good conflict or bad conflict. We have to be emotionally invested in the protagonist. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to like the protagonist and be rooting for him. Some of the best characters in contemporary literature are terrible, terrible people that we want to see fail. Same thing with a lot of TV shows. Like if you watched Breaking Bad, same thing. We don't like Walter White. He's a terrible person, but we're still rooting for him. So there has to be an emotional investment in the protagonist, or the reader's not going to give a shit what happens to him. We're not going to care. So we have to be emotionally invested in the protagonist. We either have to love him or hate him. We have to have an extreme emotional attachment to the protagonist. The character must change. Whatever the events in the plot of the story are, at the end of the story, the character has to have changed somehow, or the reader's going to feel cheated. You always need to satisfy your reader at the end of the story. All the plot lines need to be tied up, and the character has to have changed in some way. That's crucially important. And then there has to be a narrative arc of some sort. The order might not be in the traditional classic story structure that's set up here. And there has to be structure to the story, but we'll go more in depth with that in the next video. The 7 basic plots. So people say that every story that could possibly be written has already been written. And that may be true. And there's definitely a similarity in the plots that are out there. These are the 7 basic plots from classical literature, but most of these still exist today. So overcoming the monster. I have here examples of Beowulf and Dracula, but a lot of times the setting of a story can act like the monster. If you think of movies with like natural disaster movies or natural disaster books, a lot of times the monster can be the environment, can be weather, those type of things. Rags to riches, that's self-explanatory. Cinderella, Aladdin, The Quest, This is when the characters in the story go on a quest to find something, to discover something, um, to do something, to resolve conflict in some way. So you think of classics like the Odyssey, and then Lord of the Rings is a quest story. The Voyage and Return. This is when um, the characters go on a voyage, and it changes them when they return. So think of Mark Twain wrote a lot of books like this, like Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, where the characters are changed by the voyage they undergo. Comedy, this is self-explanatory. These are some classic examples of the importance of being earnest and moonstruck. Tragedy, comedy and tragedy are very sort of loose genres. A lot of things fit into comedy and tragedy. Tragedy, Moby Dick, Anna Karenina, The Great Gatsby, almost anything by Shakespeare. Think of, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, a ton of them. And then Rebirth is where the hero or heroine, the protagonist, falls under some sort of dark power and is born again at the end, and some released by that darkness in some way. So you think of Snow White, Christmas Carol, Sleeping Beauty. Those Charles Dickens wrote a lot of stories like this. So these are kind of the catch-all, but there are other. I guess you could say there are other plots out there, but these are kind of the 7 basic plots. These are the where most of the stories that are written originate from one of these 7 basic plots. Horizontal versus vertical stories. A horizontal story is a plot of physical events leading through to a resolution. This is what you typically think of when you think of a story. But a lot of stories are told vertically. It's an emotional, psychological journey. If anybody reads memoirs, a lot of memoirs are structured vertically, where temporally or chronologically they jump around a lot, but the story follows the emotional journey. Sorry, my dogs are freaking out. Typically, though, and in the context of this class, you're going to mostly read and write horizontal stories. But if you want to write a vertical story and one that follows an emotional, psychological journey, go for it. All right, hiding the gun. This is a technique used often in storytelling, but it also relates to the details that you put into a story. I once had a professor say that if in chapter 1 you are setting up the scene and you're in the main character's house and there's a gun in a drawer, you have to come back to that gun at some point, or the detail's meaningless. That gun has to come back later in the story for some reason. You don't put in details that don't matter. Every detail is important. Now, when it relates to hiding the gun is a metaphor, or is a symbol. But hiding the gun is a detail, mistake, or flaw set up in the beginning of the story that comes back to bite the protagonist in the ass. I have here that it destroys the protagonist, or ruins the protagonist, but that's not necessarily true. It's detail, mistake, or flaw that comes back and causes conflict for the protagonist. And a lot of writers do this when you're setting up a story or introducing characters and giving details of the characters. You often, might point out or show us a flaw or a character defect or something like that. That's going to ultimately come back to be a crucial part of the story later on. And this is a good thing to maybe get in the habit of. Hiding the gun as a framing device. It forces you to a resolution without losing your narrative momentum. So if at the beginning of your story you know that your character's alcoholism is going to lead to his downfall, you establish that in the beginning and you slowly build to that point when that comes back into conflict. So it forces you to move through the narrative arc into resolution without losing momentum. Plotting story. One of the, this is where outlining and pre-writing comes into play, and it's very important. But one thing that you need to always keep in mind is that you don't write anything that's not necessary. So whenever you go to write a scene, you need to know what the purpose of every scene is before you write it. Does it ask a question? Does it answer a question? Does it change the tone of the story somehow? Does it develop the character? Does it create conflict? Does it resolve conflict? You need to know the purpose of every scene before you sit down to write it. And then all plot points must be resolved by the ending, or the reader's not going to be satisfied. If you leave holes in the story, and this drives me nuts, when a story has plot holes in it and not everything's resolved at the end. The end of the story, the stage called resolution, the conflict must be resolved, the plot points must be resolved, and the character development must be resolved, meaning that the character must change in some way. There's also, I should put this here, there's also this theory called stasis theory, which is that at the beginning of a story, the characters in a sense is in a state of stasis where there's equilibrium in their life. Then the inciting incident happens, which takes them out of this place of stasis or equilibrium. We go through the narrative arc, and then at the end of the story, we come to a new equilibrium or a new stasis, which the character will then continue to live through after the story ends. So, it might help you to think of plotting your story that way, that we have to begin at this place of equilibrium or stasis, and then move through the arc, and then come to a new place of equilibrium or stasis. Like I said earlier, this video goes into more detail about story and plot, and in the next one we'll discuss structure and the narrative arc and how to manipulate structure in the different forms of structure that are typically seen in contemporary literature.